You're listening to the Doc Lounge podcast. This is a place for candid healthcare conversations with physician recruitment industry's top executives and thought leaders. This podcast is made possible by Pacific Companies, your trusted advisor in physician recruitment. Today on the podcast, we have another inspiring woman, Ann Massey Badmus. Ann is an immigration attorney and strategist. She is also an author of the book Perscription, the practical guide to U.S. immigration for foreign-born physicians. She is also an immigrant advocate. She founded the Immigrant Journey Awards, also the Immigrant Entrepreneur Network, the DFW Global Co-work. She's a part of the New American Economy. She won Top 25 Women in Business for the Dallas Business Journal. She was voted top lawyers in Dallas from 2016 to present. So we are really excited to talk to Ann and pick her brain on physician immigration. So thank you so much, Ann, for being here. And let's get started.
So, Ann, as we get started, why don't you just tell us a little bit about your background and what made you want to become an immigration attorney?
Okay. Well, I am an immigration attorney, as you mentioned, and I started out in law about 30 years ago and actually had gone into corporate law for a little while in Delaware, and kind of decided personally to start my own practice, mainly because I thought it would be more flexible in terms of family life. So I started my own practice, and one of the areas I became interested in, mainly because I had some personal experience with it. My husband is from Nigeria, so we went through the immigration process for him, and so I decided to make immigration one of the areas that I would practice. So that was about 20, 25 years, 26 years ago. I started to do that and really started to focus mainly on immigration when I moved to Texas, which is where I am now, the Dallas, Texas area. And that sort of took off, and I just decided to specialize in immigration and haven't regretted it ever since.
Wonderful. Well, I noticed you have a book called The Immigration Perscription. What gave you the impetus to put your thoughts down into a book?
Yeah, really just to pass on knowledge and make it I just really think it's important for clients to be informed as much as possible. And a lot of times there's a lot of information out there, especially on the internet. And we have so much access to information. Unfortunately, much of it, or a lot of it, might not be correct, especially when it comes to law, because it is a complicated area. So I found that having clients who were well informed actually were more successful, were honestly easier to work with if they understood, what the process was. And I thought having a book that I could really control that information and make sure it's accurate was important. So I decided to publish that and allow, people who were interested, particularly doctors, of course, who wanted to immigrate to the U.S. or are already in the U.S. and going through the immigration process could really have good information about what that involves. Now, it's not a replacement for advice because, I can only really provide general legal information, but it's very important that anyone going through that process really gets specific advice for them.
Great. Now, kind of a broad question. What steps do foreign-born physicians need to take to prepare for this process?
It kind of depends on where they are. And what I mean by that is where they are in terms of wanting to immigrate to the U.S. We do get a lot of physicians who are in their home countries. They've completed their medical degree and are really kind of looking into wanting to practice in the United States. So typically what they really need to understand is the immigration process, of course, and a lot of that does require that they actually, in many ways, start over again, not necessarily go back to medical school, but if they've done training in their home countries, they will still have to do training here. They'll have to, of course, get licensed here. And in order to do that, they need to understand what the immigration process is for that. It is pretty limited in terms of the ways that foreign physicians can immigrate to practice here. So they really need to, like many who do, probably one of the resources they need to find is an immigration attorney who can help them through that process.
Okay. And typically, how long does it take to prepare to immigrate to the United States?
Well, once the physicians have completed their testing, which is the USMLE scores testing that they have to take, if they've passed all of those and are eligible and get matched into a residency program or a fellowship program, then typically that's a fairly quick process, at least in terms of immigration time, which is probably a couple of months or so that they can actually get their visas to come here and go through their training. But the real, complexity comes in when they have completed their training and now want to work in the United States. So that process in itself, and for them to finally get permanent status to remain in the United States and eventually become citizens, it really depends on what country they're from, because there's some long waiting lists for people who want to become immigrants or become permanent residents in the United States. And that could be anywhere from 2 or 3 years to 12 years or more. So
Wow.
it ranges. Yes, it's a very wide range, and sometimes we that 12 years is sort of an estimate. So in particular, for example, doctors who are born in India or from India, they tend to have the longest waiting time, and it's mainly because of the numbers of people that come to the United States from India. Our system currently limits the numbers of people that can come from any particular country. We basically give the same number of visas, or immigrant visas, which is permanent residence, to nationals of every country. So as you imagine, there's over 100 countries, and some countries are larger than others, like India and China. And so they're still limited to that small number, and that makes their waiting time very long.
Is there any special circumstances where there might be a physician who's specialty trained and is needed here, that you can kind of have him pass the waiting list?
Well, sometimes not necessarily with specialties, although specialties are sometimes do have a little better chance, and that is mainly through what we call the employment-based extraordinary ability process. So what that means is that if a physician can show that they have achieved somewhat national recognition, whether it's in the United States or in their home country, they could actually get here a lot faster, because they're considered what's called priority workers, people who have demonstrated some amount of success, and so they're really given a faster track. So, for example, I've worked with a couple of physicians from India, from South Africa, from Brazil, who have not done training here, but they are very well recognized in their specialty. And when I say well recognized, I mean, basically in the medical field, they are recognized for some of the achievements they've had. So, for example, they might have completed some research, have research articles, have been won some awards for their work, have been again well recognized. So we've actually been able to get them permanent resident status, and they come to the United States with permanent resident status, as opposed to going through all of the other things that other physicians might have to do. So,
and when you say permanent residence, you mean the green card?
Right, the green card, which green card is a prerequisite for becoming a citizen. So that's kind of a very important step.
Okay. Well, I've heard through the years the EAD. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So the EAD stands for Employment Authorization Document. Excuse me, and that is really work permission. The government gives permission for an immigrant to work through the EAD. That's one way that they get work permission. The advantage of the EAD is that it is not limited to work for any particular employer, so you can work in any field and for any employer. But it usually is limited. It's a temporary work authorization. It usually lasts from anywhere from 1 year to 2 years, and it can be renewed. For physicians, most of the time when you will see them have an EAD might be through the green card process, where they are in the process for the green card. And as part of that process, or like at least in certain stages of that process, they are allowed or given an EAD in order to work. You also have what's called the H4 EAD, which is for spouses of H-1B workers. There's a limited number of H-4 EADs available for spouses who's who want to work, of course, but also that the H-1B worker is in the green card process. So if the H-1B worker is in the green card process, then their spouse can get an H-4 EAD. However, that's probably going away pretty soon. The current administration has decided that they will probably not will take back that benefit and only allow those who may be already have an H-4 EAD to continue with that, but they will not allow new H-4 EADs. There are other ways for people to have EADs as well. So it's just a wide range of opportunities to get an EAD.
And with the EAD, does that then allow the physician candidate to secure a position that a green card would be needed for?
Well, yes. I mean, it's an advantage because it does not require the employer to do any paperwork. Like an H-1B visa, the employer has to complete the application and get approval. Whereas an EAD, all you need to do is to present that to the employer in order to work. So yes, it's an advantage definitely for those who have the EAD.
Okay. What can you tell us the difference between J1 and H1? We have a lot of physicians calling in and they say, I'm a J1, I'm a H1. For our listening audience, what could you elaborate on in that category?
Sure. So the J1 and H1 are both sort of what we call work visas, particularly for physicians. Physicians can come to the U.S. To do their residency or fellowship training, and they can come either with a J1 visa or an H1 visa. The difference is really in terms of what happens after they've completed their training, because with the J1 visa physician, part of the J1 visa requirement is that they agree to go back to their home country after they've completed their residency training for at least 2 years before they would be eligible to work in the United States. So that, of course, is for those who would rather work immediately after residency training would be, an issue. So with the J1 physician who is completing residency and now wants to work immediately, they would have to get a J1 waiver. The waiver is waiving the requirement that they go back for 2 years. And in order to get that waiver, they would, there's a couple of ways, but the main way is to get government sponsorship of that waiver by first finding employment in usually an underserved area and having the employer apply to the state and in some cases the federal government for a waiver of that 2-year home residency requirement. If they get that waiver approved, then the next step would be actually to apply for an H-1B visa, which would now allow them to start working after their training. So that's what happens with a J1 physician who did their training in J1. For recruiters who are looking at physicians who are only have an H-1B and they've completed their training in H-1B, then they don't need to be concerned with whether the work location is underserved or where they need to get a waiver. However, there are some other requirements that kind of limit the eligibility of those H-1B physicians to work. Mainly the requirement that what has happened is the physician who has trained with an H-1B visa typically has been able to get the H-1B visa because they are working with a university or a nonprofit university affiliated training program. And why that's important is that H-1B visas usually are limited every year to about 65,000 to 85,000 visas available. So most people have to compete for those because a lot of people want those H-1B visas. And so and that's through any occupation, not necessarily medical, but any occupation. And so it could be very difficult to even get an H-1B visa because of that limited number. However, if the employer is a university or a nonprofit affiliated with a university, then they do not need to be concerned with the limited number. There's an unlimited number available to those types of employers. And so most of the time, the H-1B physicians who have completed their training have gotten their H-1B through that kind of employment situation. And so they're considered what's called cap exempt, meaning they are not bound by the limited number of H-1Bs available each year. The issue that comes up for, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say the issue that comes up for those H-1B cap exempt physicians who are now completing their training and wanting to work is that if they do not find another qualified cap exempt employer, then they will have to come to actually be considered a new H-1B, which has to be counted against that 65,000 to 85,000 cap, which means they would have to again compete with maybe 200,000 people applying for those types of visas.
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I didn't hear you mention anything about for-profit hospitals and H-1Bs. Is there a process to get a visa sponsored through a for-profit hospital?
Right. So if the hospital is for-profit, then they can apply for an H-1B, but they would have to compete with that cap situation. If the physician has had an H-1B a cap exempt H-1B, or they've never had an H-1B, then if they go to work for a for-profit hospital, they will have to compete for the 65,000 H-1B visas. So while they can apply, right now it's sort of a lottery system. So we probably see about a 33% chance of obtaining one of those visas through that process.
Okay. What can you tell us about the term, the Conrad 30?
Sure. So the Conrad 30 is actually a federal law that authorizes states to issue 30 J1 waivers every year. So as I mentioned earlier about J1 waivers needed for those doctors who completed their training in J1, those waivers, the waivers that I mentioned are Conrad 30 waivers, where each state, again, has an opportunity to take applications from doctors and employers who want to work in underserved areas, or what we call flex areas, which I can explain in a minute. But mainly the underserved areas qualify for these Conrad 30 waivers. But the program, while it's federal, each state can have their own criteria for approving those kinds of applications for waivers, and it is discretionary.
Okay, and is it just for primary care, or is there also the opportunity for a subspecialist to get a waiver?
Sure. Most of the states do, of course, favor primary care, but they also will consider specialists. Each state has a different criteria for when they would approve a specialist. Most of the time, they would like to see that there is a need for specialists in the area. So sometimes the applicant may need to have, or the employer may need to provide letters or data showing that there's a shortage of that specialty in that particular area. So yes, we worked with lots of specialists in all the states. There are also some other programs, J1 waiver programs that will work with specialists as well. There's the Delta Regional Authority, which takes applications all year long and is not limited to any number of J1 waivers. So they can also sponsor specialists, but they are only covering certain parts of the country, which is about 13 states around Missouri, parts of Illinois, down through Alabama and Louisiana.
I had a question. I've had several physicians ask me over the years, of the 65 to 85,000 visas that are available, what percent go to physicians versus other applicants, let's say?
Sure. I don't know exactly. I've seen a little bit of data on that. I would probably say it's probably more like 5%. It's very small. The largest industry that you will see is the IT industry that takes a great majority of those visas, and then other occupations kind of spread out from there. So the STEM fields are the ones that we see mostly taking the visas. So medical is pretty small compared to the others.
Mm-hmm. Wow.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we're almost out of time already. Is there anything else that you'd like to kind of add on, or any tips you would say for any international physicians thinking about coming to work in the U.S.?
Sure. So yeah, I would say in terms of tips for international physicians is really kind of getting as much advice as possible from experts. So for example, from attorneys, of course, immigration attorney, that's going to be something that should be number one on the list, because that really is, even if they've done all of the testing, they've been approved for the USMLE, even gotten a residency, they really need to understand what their process is, what their plans are, and having an attorney help them sort of plan out over the years, their practice and what they plan to do in the U.S. I would also say to, of course, talk to other physicians who have gone through that process in the U.S. and just kind of get tips from them as well. But ultimately, they actually need expert advice to help them through that process.
If someone wants to get your book, The Immigration Perscription, where can they get it?
Sure, it's actually on Amazon, and they can also go to my website. It's immigrationmd.com.
Mm-hmm. Perfect. And we'll put a link at the bottom of the podcast so everyone knows where to get everything. Well, thank you so much for chatting with us. It was super helpful.
Oh, great. Well, thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you, Ann.
Yeah, no problem. Well, have a great day.
You
Bye.
too. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you to all our listeners. If you'd like to be notified when new episodes air, make sure to hit that subscribe button. And thank you to Pacific Companies. Without you guys, this podcast would not be possible. If you'd like to be a guest or for more information, go to www.pacificcompanies.com.